Welcome to Pax Britannica. Shattered Lands with Sam Dalrymple. Today, I'm happy to welcome the documentary maker, author and historian Sam Dalrymple. Sam is a co-founder of Project Dastan, an initiative which aims to bring together people disconnected and displaced by the 1947 partition of India. He's with me today to talk about his new book, Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia. He generously sent me an early copy for my work on Winds of Change, and I highly recommend it. You can find a link to Shattered Lands in the episode description, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Sam Dalrymple, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we just get into the meat of the book, it's talking about the partition of the British Indian Empire, the Raj. So I think it would be good to just set the stage. What was the Raj? How big was it? And what are we talking about here?
So this is the big surprise of essentially the book, is that I think most books on this topic talk about India, British India, as being, you know, the jewel in the crown, etc., the most important British colony that included India and Pakistan. The truth is that in the 1920s, basically 100 years ago today, this was a colony that included a quarter of the world's population and didn't just include 2 modern nation states, but 12. It was so big that its true size was not permitted to be shown on maps. Its true size was kind of hidden from the imperial maps. And it included the countries of modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also southern Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Burma. It's a much larger world than we often think it is. And my story is how in 5 decades, 5 partitions break this world apart, and kind of how the lines drawn by nationalism and by imperialists have created the map of modern Asia that we see today.
That's an amazing summary. And so that leads nicely into my first question, which is, what are those 5 partitions? A couple immediately come to mind, but it seems like there's much more than that.
So it all begins with the separation of Burma in 1937. And one of the things that I found in the course of this book is how each of these partitions influences the next one. And so I was very surprised to see, when you go to the early debates over the creation of Pakistan, they're explicitly looking back at the creation of Burma, shaving off, India's eastern province and creating a new border. They see that as the model for all of the subsequent partitions. After that, from between 1937 and 1947, first Aden and then the rest of the Arabian states, Qatar, Bahrain, etc., are gradually separated. With the last ones, Dubai, etc., is only separated in April 47, so just months before Indian and Pakistani independence. The third partition is the partition of British India, so how the directly ruled bits of the Raj were divided by an imperial administrator called Cyril Radcliffe. But then one of the things that I then, and that was done on the basis of religion. So, the Muslim majority bits went to a new country called Pakistan, and the Hindu majority bits became a country called India. And the migration that this triggered remains the largest forced migration in human history. It continues to shape the entire politics of the subcontinent and is arguably the central event in South Asian, one of the central events in 20th century history. It continues to shape how a quarter of the world perceive the world today. The fourth partition, though, is about the partition of princely India. So there were all these princely states, these semi-independent states that, like Jaipur, Jodhpur, Kashmir, Hyderabad, that were never fully ruled by the British. The British ran their kind of foreign policy and defence, etc. But internally, they were still essentially run as they had been before the British ever arrived, as a kind of, a kingdom with their own internal governments. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that the border, say, between India and Pakistan today, although it's always derided as a kind of, a legacy of imperialists, 81% of that border was made by the decisions of just 7 princes, as opposed to Cyril Radcliffe, who only actually designed about 19% of that border. He drew the border between the two Punjabs, the Muslim majority side of Punjab and the Hindu majority bit of Punjab. But the rest of the border that snakes its way from the Arabian Sea through Sindh, the borders of Rajasthan, and then, of course, through Kashmir, that whole section is basically created by princes. And then the final partition is the partition of Pakistan itself. In the wake of a brutal war and Pakistan's kind of military crackdown on its eastern province and Bengali nationalists in its eastern province, there's a brutal crackdown. It leads to a massive refugee crisis, huge numbers of people killed. And in the wake of that, a country called Bangladesh emerges. And after the creation of Bangladesh, this time by war, rather than imperial borders being drawn, but afterwards, the same sort of thing has to happen. Again, there has to be a division of assets. Again, there has to be, a population transfers between these new countries. You've got all these, West Pakistanis stuck in East Pakistan. You've got all these Bengalis, Bangladeshis kind of stuck in West Pakistan, etc. And what happens between 1971 to 1975, I would call, the fifth partition, sorry. The division of assets and the creation of 2 new nation states.
So why did you want to write about this? Where does this come from? Why the interest in this?
I grew up in Delhi. My family moved there in 2004. My parents had actually been living in India before I was born, but then they moved back to the UK for a brief bit to be around grandparents, etc. And I think partition is kind of ever present in India, and particularly Delhi. It's a city of partition refugees. A huge proportion of the population arrived, and virtually the entirety of pre-1947 Delhi lives in Karachi now in Pakistan, and virtually all of my friends are Punjabi with family from the other side of the border, from what's now Pakistan, Hindus or Sikhs who've arrived over. And so it was always there, but I started working on a project called Project Astan in university. The idea was that India and Pakistan still don't offer a tourist agreement, but that the right to return home for most of these refugees has never really worked. Most people who are now in their 80s and 90s have never been able to see their childhood home, their childhood mosque, their childhood temple, their childhood school, their childhood sweet shop, the playground, whatever. And so we created this kind of company, essentially, that would use virtual reality. We'd interview someone about where they wanted to see and then send a team member on the other side to make a virtual reality video for them so that they could walk through their old streets again. And a couple times we managed to reconnect childhood friends who'd been divided. That was a very sort of, emotional work to be doing. So I got into partition through that. But then there was a particular conversation that I had, which led me to the rest of this book. It was with someone from Tripura in northeast India. Gradually, we realised after about 2 years of doing this that most of our interviewees were basically coming from kind of Punjab, Bengal, the kind of main provinces affected, and tended to be kind of upper caste, upper class elites who spoke English, because we were getting most of our interviewees from Instagram, and that was a self-selecting group. It was making us only speak to people who would be on Instagram, if that makes sense. But so we started trying to branch out, and particularly with northeast India, which was hugely affected by the border, but very rarely comes up in discussions of partition. And this guy in Tripura, we said, how did partition affect the area, etc. And he was an academic who was kind of advising us. And he said, which partition? I was like, what? And he said, because, in our area, we've had 3 partitions. I was like, what? He says, and then he says, first there was Burma separated in 1937. And then there was, in 1947, suddenly a new country called Pakistan appeared right next to us as well. And then in 1971, East Pakistan turned into Bangladesh, and we got another wave of refugees showing up. So in our area, we talk about like 3 separate partitions, and that got me thinking. Wait, firstly, I didn't really know about Burma really being part of India, and obviously it makes sense from someone in the borderlands near Burma that looms large, but in a way that it just never did in Delhi. And so the more that I started researching what was the true scale of the Raj, the more I was just kind of fascinated. And particularly the Arabian story, the fact that half of the Arabian Peninsula, basically all of it with the exception of Saudi Arabia and North Yemen, had been ruled from Delhi, and yet it never shows up in any books on the Raj. There's this there's this kind of hidden history of the Raj in the region that I just find that absolutely fascinating. The fact that Dubai could have been part of modern India or Pakistan is bonkers.
Absolutely. I think it's something that came up in my own research, looking at the campaigns in the First World War and the disastrous Mesopotamian campaign, and how part of the reason that was such a disaster was because you had London and you had Delhi, and neither Delhi technically had authority over it because it was in their sphere. And I was like, oh, really? And then reading your book, I was like, oh, of course it was, because, they're landing at Basra. They're only up the road from places that were still within the Raj.
I remember actually some of the first books that I read that talked about it were books on World War One. I think there was a throwaway couple of lines in Eugene Rogan's Fall of the Ottomans that talked about the India office kind of telling the Whitehall kind of get off our turf. And I just got, that was one of the earliest references that I remember thinking, oh, interesting.
I mean, some of the best histories come out of seeing throwaway lines like that in other works and going, hang on, what is that? Why? Why is that there? And you pull on that thread and you discover, and then you write a book. It seems to happen like that. But speaking of that aspect of it, I'm curious about your research process, because that's a hell of a lot of ground to cover. How many different languages are you working with there? How was that to what kind of source base were you working with? That kind of thing.
I used a lot of, so there was archives in, I think, 3 different countries. So I looked in archives in Britain, in India, and then private archives in Pakistan. I didn't get into any of the state archives, but I got into lots of private collections. One of the best ones that I managed to get into was I went to stay with the family of Feroz Khan Noon, who was the last kind of democratically elected Prime Minister of Pakistan before the first coup. And his private papers didn't seem to have been gone into by any researchers, really. And they're all just kind of sitting there in Lahore. So kind of really amazing stuff is just, sitting there. A lot was also done through oral histories. So I think if there's any criticism of the kind of sources that I've done, it's that the written sources that I've used tend to be either English or Hindi and Urdu, which are the kind of languages that I'm comfortable in. But in terms of interviews, I've made sure to use as well as English, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Konyak, Arabic, Burmese, and there is another that I can't remember right now. But yeah, so I Project Astan, the partition project that I was doing before, we had, all of the interviews that we'd been doing for years had been done in non-English languages by and large. And particularly we had on the team Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi and Bengali speakers. And so that was amazingly helpful because I had team members doing these things in kind of often remote areas. And then one of the funnest moments was going around the borderlands of Nagaland and Burma, in kind of northeast India and Burma borderlands, where I had a friend who spoke Konyak, Fajin Konyak, she's amazing, kind of completely badass woman, who has done an amazing book on the tattoo art of Naga world, of the Konyak community, and she took me just across the border, because in that area it's still not walled. So we went kind of wandering into Burma, and crucially, the Indian border guards were all there and kind of said, make sure you're back by sundown, essentially. And then on the Burmese side, the junta was busy fighting rebels somewhere, and so they weren't there, and they hadn't shown up in about 3 months. And so it was the kind of most bizarre thing. So we just kind of wandered over the border and down into kind of some village huts on the other side, and started chatting to all these people about what the border meant for them, and how. Do they remember when the border arrived? And it was very interesting kind of conversations came out of that. So I managed to visit basically all the countries with the exception of Yemen, thanks to civil war. Even Burma, I managed to get to at least the south and around Yangon. But Yemen proved somewhat trickier.
I have to imagine it would have been. So now I want to ask about so when you say you had the advantage of your colleagues at Project Astan.
Yeah.
Were you able to, because you'd interviewed people for that project.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to reuse some of those conversations for the book?
Yeah, so I'd say there's probably about kind of 30 conversations from Project Astan that have been mentioned. Also from the 1947 Partition archive, shout out to them, because they have put together probably the most comprehensive database of interviews with people, some of whom are huge political players, and it's recording their memories of events that they played a huge role in. Others are, you can ask them, when I wanted to find interviews from Hyderabad, I was able to say, I'd love a Dalit perspective. I'd love a Zoroastrian Parsi perspective on what's going on in the area, because I know there was a huge Parsi community there. And you were able to just get these stories because they've got so many of them in their database now. And they're open to scholars. So if anyone's listening to this and is trying to research this world, do have a look. And then the other one is often people had diaries, that I've not mentioned, but so there's a Sikh miner called Uttam Singh that had a diary written about their migration from Burma during the Long March during World War II, and that was in a Gurmukhi script, Punjabi language diary that was sitting in an attic in North London. So there's lots of those sort of sources in the book.
Now I'm curious about the diaspora element of this. In the aftermath of any kind of mass migration and disaster, which a lot of these partitions were, people left the region entirely, particularly to the UK. How was the South Asian diaspora community? Do they appear in your book much?
Yes. Their stories do, but I don't necessarily go that deep into the story, the story of being kind of South Asian in Britain, which is a completely different story. Yeah. But there's definitely a lot of people that I've interviewed who I met here in London. But interestingly, again, like I was talking about Project Astan, the types of people that you're likely to meet in the diaspora are also a self-selecting group, if that makes sense. It tends to be people who had the means to move. And so you tend to find fewer Dalits in the UK, British diaspora, South Asia. And it tends to be, for example, partition stories here tend to be overwhelmingly Punjabi and Bengali. You're much less likely to meet Telugu speakers or to meet people who migrated from from Sindh. It tends to be these certain communities who arrived. Likewise, if you meet a Kashmiri in London, they tend to be from Mirpur, because there was a huge migration from the specific area on the Pakistani side of the line of control in Kashmir, where the Mirpuri community all moved down here. But you tend to find fewer people from, say, Ladakh or from Srinagar that have moved to the UK. So it's a self-selecting group, but there are some brilliant stories and some amazing work that's been done here as well. And notably, I think Kavita Puri's book Partition Voices is probably the best British partition book, if not one of the best partition books written. So yeah,
you beat me to it with Kavita. I was almost like, I know, I can think of one in particular. What surprised you? Like you talked about, the surprise of finding yourself in Burma and walking past absent border guards and people like that. But was there anything that you went into this you'd already had the initial surprise of realizing, oh, how many partitions there really were, and how widespread the Raj was. But beyond that, when you were actually getting into the weeds of it, and even when you were writing, did anything surprise you?
One of the things that we were just chatting about before we started recording, but the fact that after India and Pakistan India and Pakistan from the moment of their birth are basically born rivals, and their civilians are murdering each other from the day that they're born. And within months, they're at war over Kashmir. By 1949, however, 2 years later, they begin to put aside their animosity to each other, and there's a decade and a bit when they're kind of collaborating. There's all sorts of interesting new research and basically declassified intelligence files that have revealed a completely new Indo-Pak relationship in the early years of the 1950s. In 1949, Indian and Pakistani intelligence collaborates with each other and shares intelligence to help stop the communist overthrow of Burma. They don't want yet another communist state in their backyard, and so India and Pakistani intelligence shares intelligence and collaborates. And that sets the tone for a decade of cooperation. There's a moment that in 1960 where a potential military alliance between the two is put on the table, and that's just bonkers to think about now. They're issuing Indo-Pakistani passports in a way that you would not, and Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, his tomb is designed by an Indian Muslim, who was living in Bombay and just commuting into Karachi. And so there's another history. There's an alternative history of the India-Pakistani relationship that where there's far more collaboration that is consistently then destroyed by basically kind of funding of proxies and separatists across each other's borders. And that applies to both India and Pakistan. They've both spent basically from 1963 onwards funding each other's separatists and proxies, and that has been immensely damaging.
I mean, it's incredibly relevant. Just like we were saying before we began recording, there's the last 50 or so years, it's rarely been a moment where it hasn't been extremely relevant. So this time of cooperation, it ends in the 60s. Why does it end in the 60s?
It ends because, bizarrely, so there's several. You can see it beginning to dwindle. You were mentioning Bandung, and why don't you just quickly chat to listeners about that before going into the fall?
Oh, okay. Oh, turn it on me. So the Bandung Conference was essentially a gathering of post-colonial South Asian and some African states who wanted to not unify, but work together. And essentially, the opening speech by Sukarno, the Indonesian leader, makes the case that around this table represents more than a third of the planetary population, and when East and West are threatening to blow each other up with nukes, why don't we cooperate? And it's this hopeful message which doesn't unfortunately last that much longer.
And India, Pakistan, and Burma are all there, and there's talk in those early days of a kind of a United States of South Asia, which would be a fascinating thing. Obviously hasn't gone that way. It begins to fall apart by the 1961, kind of down to the relationship between Nehru and Ayub Khan, where Ayub Khan, the first military ruler of Pakistan, basically feels snubbed by Nehru and feels that Nehru doesn't give him the right respect that he deserves and all this kind of thing. And then in 1961, India sends the army into Goa, in what's known in India as the liberation of Goa. It's seen in India by Indians as the final act of decolonization, the final bit of India that is ruled over by Europeans still, because this was ruled by the Portuguese at the time, will be given back to Indians, kind of thing. Pakistan does not see it that way and sees it as the opening shots of Indian expansionism. And the mood in the wake of Goa convinces Ayub Khan and the Pakistani cabinet that India is expansionist and it aims to kind of essentially reabsorb bits of the subcontinent that had once belonged to India. It sees it as a kind of new irredentist mode of Indian governance, essentially. And so from this point onwards, Pakistan kind of begins turning on India and begins funding Indian separatists in northeast India, specifically the Nagas. He reaches out to Fizo, who's the head of the Naga independence movement, and offers funding and opens training camps for Naga rebels as basically a kind of, probably initially as a kind of bargaining chip to kind of, weaken India and project Pakistani power, but also just kind of put them on the bargaining table. But of course, it doesn't go this way because India immediately starts funding proxies in Pakistan in response, including, the several Bengali rebels who will play a key role in the independence of Bangladesh from East Pakistan. And so, although Kashmir today is the big, clash between the two countries, actually in the early days, it's northeast India and the border of Bangladesh is far more rife with intrigue, I'd say.
And do you get the impression from the sources, because it seems like it's almost like an overreaction from Pakistan to see India take Goa, which is tiny in the grand scheme of things, to see that as the first step in an eventual clash with Pakistan? I don't know. That seems. Obviously it made a logical sense to them at the time. Do we get a feeling of why that was?
It's unclear precisely what's going on, and I think it has to be viewed within the sense of the Cold War, within the India's response to funding. So a lot of the good work that's been done on this have been using Indian declassified files, but not the declassified Pakistani files. And there's a particular book called India's Near East by Avinash Paliwal, where we get a very vivid sense now from the files that are available to us about the Indian side of this. Mm-hmm. The Pakistani one is a bit like a black box. Most of the intelligence files haven't been released, and it's more unclear what's going on there. And crucially, I think, most of the, a lot of the files that from East Pakistan, where all this was happening, were burnt during the independence war of Bangladesh, and so will never be available to us. As a result, from the Pakistani side, we're reliant more on memoirs than the actual cold hard files, but that's also, naturally open to, misremembering things or outright kind of lying. And as you get in several people, a lot of people treat their memoirs as they're writing their legacies, and so memoirs have to be taken with a bit more of a pinch of salt than the cold hard files that tell us exactly what's going on the day. I think Avinash Paliwal has opened a new is she called Pallavi Raghavan, who wrote an amazing book called Animosity at Bay, all about this, but all about the sort of sudden moment of friendship. But I don't think she goes in quite as much detail as to how the whole thing falls apart. And I think that there's some amazing new scholarship that needs to be done on that. Because I think that that famously in all books that write about South Asia, everyone talks about that, the third decade, the third quarter of the 20th century has basically not really been studied properly. You've got very good stuff on basically the lead up to partition, and then very good stuff in the wake of Bangladeshi independence in the 70s and 80s, when suddenly there's all sorts of amazing scholarship about independent South Asia, about the rising economy, etc. And actually, the 60s, the 50s and 60s, there's virtually no proper studies on, or it's begun in the last few decades, but it's you've got mountains of sources and PhDs and books on all the other decades, and the 50s and 60s just haven't had the same treatment.
So following on from that, where does Shattered Lands fit within the wider historiography? This book also kind of jumps over those 2 decades, but does it fit within this growing interest in that period? Do you place the fifth partition in context that's that way?
I think I think from the outset one of the things that I wanted to do was so many books end or begin in 1947.
Mm-hmm.
And don't trace the gradual, and I was very certain from the start that I wanted to have 1947 in the middle of the book, because it's not, the end or a beginning. It's part of a larger process, right? And so I've got about kind of 4 chapters that sort of have to race through the 50s and 60s, but I'm quite happy with the way that it turned out, and trying to trace these proxy wars. And the growth of independent India and Pakistan and their relationship, and also Burma and how it plays into that as well. I was very like the more huge amount of research still needs to be done, but I think that we're beginning. And I hopefully that comes across in the book. I think we're beginning to understand that period far better than we ever have before.
My next question kind of it may be very similar to what you just said, but what was the thesis of Shattered Lands? What were you trying to say with it?
I think it's multifold. Firstly, the story here is much bigger, and the legacies of these many partitions are so profound and interlinked. The fact that, I think we all know that Kashmir has its origins from this, but far few people realise that, for example, the Rohingya crisis and the genocide there, likewise the kind of Naga insurgency and the Mizo insurgency, are all to do with borders slashing communities in two. The Gulf War is a direct legacy of, the British, of Kuwait essentially having been part of the British Raj. And I think that there's all these conflicts are far more interlinked. I also think that I want, part of the thesis is about nationalism and the way that nationalisms have, each time the map was redrawn, new stories were rapidly concocted to make the new map seem timeless, right? And as nationalism hardens today, and we're seeing the resurgence of nationalism, the resurgence of new walls going up, etc. I think it's interesting to focus on how damaging that is right now. One of the reviews that came up recently talked about that. This is the thing that they found rather interesting, was the way that we often talk about the legacies of imperialism. We talk far less about the legacies of nationalisms, and each ones have their, have horrors that they've created. Obviously, imperialism is far kind of, is far more complex, but we're living with nationalism now, and in a sense, studying its emergence is rather fascinating. And and equally as fascinating is to study what could have been. The number of alternatives, the number of near misses, the number of moments that, the creation of entire nations was almost averted is fascinating. And the kind of somewhat haphazard way that these nations were, so often you hear about countries concoct their national narratives as each step logically leading to the next. And you chat to many Pakistani nationalists and they talk about, the story of Pakistan began with Muhammad bin Qasim arriving in Sindh in 632 AD with the Caliphate, and that kind of thing. And of course, actually, as late as 1945, Pakistan was not necessarily going to happen. Burma's leading politicians were all against the creation of a country called Burma right into the mid-30s. Ottama, who was the leading nationalist of the time, was very certain that it should remain the easternmost province of India. and he based his argument on the fact that this is part of a greater nation called Bharat, and the holy land of the Buddha is in India. So there's all sorts of kind of could have beens that are just fascinating to look at.
That is that is really interesting. Because I was going to ask, okay, were the leading politicians of Burma, were they Burmese, or were they expats from India? But no, there's a justifiable logic there that of course they would see themselves part of this wider world.
Yeah, and also Ottama makes a very important point that Hinduism and Buddhism come from the same roots and are reactions to one another in a sense. They've both emerged from the same soil, and it's much as kind of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all reactions to one another, and have emerged from the same roots. And they share a holy land. And there's a very interesting interplay between the politics of early Burma and the politics of the subcontinent, particularly between kind of Burmese and Hindu nationalists, that I found rather fascinating. How much Hindu nationalists are in conversation with Burmese nationalists.
Mm. Maybe this is one of the legacies of the what could have been, but was there much talk between the South Asia and Southeast Asia? Because obviously there's significant Buddhist populations, Hindu populations throughout the East Indies.
So there is a lot of connections, particularly between Burma and the rest. You've got to remember that often it was easier to travel within the British Empire because you had British Empire sort of, passports, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you were living in India, it was very easy to go to Burma. It was also very easy to go to Malaya and Singapore because that was also a British colony. It was more difficult to go. You had to get a visa, etc., in order to go to like French Indochina or Dutch Indonesia, Dutch East Indies, or Thailand, which was an independent thing altogether. That being said, there is a huge amount of communities that were doing precisely that. I think most notably the Chettiars in what's now Tamil Nadu, who were these kind of Southeast Asia's biggest microfinance group, basically. And they kind of underwrote the economy of Tamil Nadu, but also Burma, Malaysia, bits of modern Vietnam, and all sorts of places around Southeast Asia had their origins, had their microfinance kind of underwritten by Chettiar loans in a way that's really fascinating today. And one of the things that I rather loved was one of the unexpected sources in this book was going to a restaurant in Chettinad called the Bangla. It's a hotel come restaurant. It's really good food. And we bought the cookbook written by the cook called Meenakshi Mayapam, who is a sort of force of nature. She helps run the Chettinad Heritage Festival, etc. And her cookbook goes into the ways that all their dishes today are underwritten by basically past connections with the rest of Southeast Asia. So you've got kind of, some dishes that have star anise from kind of a certain bit of Southeast Asia. And then Kavani Arsi is a dish that very much has black rice from Burma. And, this, even though they eat it in Tamil Nadu today and see it as a kind of, a Chettiar dish, the different dishes essentially kind of can tell you about where different bits of their diaspora had sailed across to during the British Imperium.
That's amazing. That's the history of food is always just so interesting, and it has so many little secrets you don't even think about unless you really think about the ingredients and how they came together.
Sri Lanka was the other place that the Chettiars had a major presence in.
That was where I was immediately thinking of as well. Just very strong, I think, linguistic ties between Sri Lanka and the northeast of the subcontinent as well.
So the two biggest languages, Sinhala and Tamil. Tamil is obviously from South India, as in and northern Sri Lanka, and then Sinhala bizarrely is related to, it's an Indo-Aryan language. So it's Indo-Iranian language, and it is more closely related to kind of Bengali and to Hindi than it is to and indeed English. You know, it's it's linguistically related, even though it uses a kind of complete different vocabulary than it is to Tamil, which is Dravidian.
So, what's next for you after you've spent how long on this book, and now you've put it in, you've got a new, it's coming out in the stores, you can relax for a bit, but what's coming next?
Sleep. No, so I've been working on this since April 2025. April 2020. Dastan, which in a sense is the origin of all of this, began in 2018. So in some senses, 7 years I've been working on Partition, but it was when Dastan had to be put on hold during COVID, and suddenly we were planning a Dastan documentary we just won a grant from National Geographic. We were going to go out to film this stuff. We were getting permits, etc. And then suddenly, bam, kind of, COVID happened. Suddenly we both traveling across borders and also interviewing 85-year-old aunties suddenly became very difficult. And so I thought, so the documentary was scrapped, and I subsequently was thinking about, well, I wrote this whole sort of pitch and might as well try to write a book. I mean, that book that I thought about writing in 2020 was a very different one to the one that has emerged. So other than that, what's next? I've got a couple more books in mind. I don't want to reveal too much because they're very much early inklings.
Mm-hmm.
But one would potentially involve something to do with French Indochina. One would go way back in time to look at the way that kind of, early religious practices have kind of permeated into the modern day, with looking at very, very, very ancient. I studied Sanskrit at university, so I'd probably one would be going back to my Sanskrit roots. And yeah, there's a kind of couple more bubbling around. I also have a big desire to discover a lost city, and
so only a tiny.
Yeah, no. I've got a city in mind, and me and my friend Anirudh were applying for a grant to discover said lost city.
You've got a lost city in mind.
No, I've got a lost city in mind. Can't tell you more than that. Unfortunately, our grant application was rejected. But if you know any people who are willing to fund discovery of lost cities, we think we know where one is.
Oh my! I'm so curious, but I know, like, you can't give that away. That's a lost city. You need to find it first.
So we're definitely gonna find the lost city.
I did. Of all the things, when I asked that question, I did not expect. We're going to try and find a lost city to be one of the.
This came from a very drunk conversation in January. Has turned into both of us being like, this is a serious career move from where we are currently. And I think we're both up for discovering it. So yeah, like.
Well, I mean, that's healthily ambitious. I'd say that's fantastic. So
I think the more likely is the next book.
Well, maybe, but I'm going to hold out hope for the Lost City.
Honestly, please, so am I.
So where can people find you? If they want to keep up to date with your excursions out to find lost cities and writing books.
Yep. So Travels of Samwise is my kind of social media handle. So I run both an Instagram and a Substack that focuses on history and historic architecture. Focus on South Asia, but not specific to South Asia. I've also done stuff on kind of ancient Mexico, Britain, Italy, Greece, etc. Vietnam. But yeah, main focus on South Asia. So Travels of Samwise, Lord of the Rings reference.
Yep, I got it.
And then the book is out in 19th of this month is when it'll be in stores, but you can pre-order now, and it seems to be arriving in people's kind of living rooms already. So yeah, we'll go and order Shattered Lands from. It's out in the UK and India and bits of Europe and Australia on the 19th, and then we'll be out in the States in February.
Fantastic. I will put links to all of that in the episode description. Sam Dalrymple, thank you so much for speaking to me today. This has been amazing.
Thank you for having me.